we mustn't believe in the golden age. It seems to me there are two types of myths of the golden age. The liberal progressive believes there's a golden age in the future. We just have to move towards this mythical future where everybody's going to be perfect. Right? That golden age is never going to exist because it contradicts human nature. But there's a certain type of conservative that believes there was a golden age in the past. And of course, with different conservatives, this golden age might be a different time in the past, right? But for this sort of conservative, everything's getting worse, right? So the past was good, the present stinks, and the future's going to be even worse, right? But you see, the problem with that is the same mentality as the progressives, right? That somehow or other, society is moving inexorably in some sort of progressive way, even if you don't like the progress, all right? But in actual fact, what history shows us is that humanity is unchanging. G.K. Chesterton wrote a book called The Everlasting Man, and the everlasting man is Jesus Christ, but we're also everlasting men because of Jesus Christ, and we all have the same human nature, which means we both aspire towards the divine, but we also are fallen and broken creatures. So sin is part of the picture, and always be part of the picture. So there's a recurring feature of human history, and that recurring feature of human history is human beings, all right? That essentially do not change. So when you look back through time, and which is why I can also predict the future will be the same, you see the same 7 deadly sins playing themselves out in human society with the same inexorable consequences, destructive consequences. You also see virtue, sanctity playing itself out with the consequence of that, which is to make life better for everybody. The more saints, the better things are. The fewer saints, the worse things are. It's not rocket science, right? But that is human history, and we seem to forget it. So, first of all, no golden age. And as we look through the rest of the talk here, I think you'll see that, right? The 1500s were not a good time. I think the 21st century is bad. Well, you wait to see what 1500s were like. And then the other thing I say in the book, we call it Heroes of the Catholic Reformation, not Saints of the Catholic Reformation, but it is about Saints of the Catholic Reformation. All the chapters in this are about saints. Because what I want to make clear is that from a Christian perspective, heroism and holiness are the same thing. All right? There is no difference. Now, of course, in a secular world, they have their ideas of heroes. Right? You have superheroes, Superman, Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, etc. Right? Or you have other sort of superheroes that are very, very popular for all time. Napoleon, Lenin, Adolf Hitler, who were hero worshipped. Or Elvis Presley, right? I took my mother on the Elvis pilgrimage when she came to America. She couldn't believe it's possible to drive to Graceland from my house, so I proved you could. So we have different understandings about what heroism is or what heroes are. But from a Christian perspective, heroism and sanctity are the same thing. Sanity and sanctity are the same thing. Heroism, holiness, the same thing. And the other thing I talk about in my book is that there were 3 reformations, not 1. So when we talk about the Reformation, we probably think about the Protestant Reformation, right? But that's only one of the 3. Yes, you had in Germany, Switzerland, other parts of Europe, you had Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and others, the Protestant Reformation, right? The adjective Protestant. But you also had in England the English Reformation, which is very different from the Protestant Reformation, which I'm going to discuss now. And then the third Reformation was the Catholic Reformation. Now that's often called the Counter-Reformation. But and I'm fine, I'm happy with that, I've no big problem with it, except it doesn't really do justice to what was happening. Because what was happening in the Catholic Church in the 1500s wasn't just defined by what it was counter, right, what it was contra. There was a genuine renewal, there was a genuine growth in holiness, new religious movements, a whole new glorious generation of saints. There was a Catholic Reformation. So there's 3 reformations. I'm going to talk first of all about the English Reformation, because I'm going to talk about some heroes of the Catholic Reformation that was a response to that. The English Reformation should never be conflated with the Protestant Reformation, for a very, very good reason. That Henry VIII was not a Protestant, he was a tyrant. And in fact, he was a Catholic tyrant, in the sense that his theology was Catholic. He wrote a pamphlet. There's arguments, historians argue about whether he was helped, and if so, by whom. Some people say St. Thomas More, some people say St. John Fisher. May have written it himself, but either way, he put his name to a pamphlet just after Luther started doing his stuff on Europe, entitled "In Defense of the Seven Sacraments" by Henry VIII. That caused Luther to go off the deep end, and he wrote a pamphlet, to Henry, King of the English, right? To which Thomas More responded on behalf both of Henry the English and the Church. The Pope gave Henry VIII the title of Fidei Defensor, defender of the faith, for the fact, as a monarch, as a Christian monarch, he stood up against Luther. So the English Reformation is not a Protestant Reformation. There were aspects of Protestantism crept in later, but that was not what the Reformation was about. What it was a secularist Reformation. And if you want to look at lessons we can learn today, it was Caesar demanding that those things should be rendered under God should be rendered unto Caesar. Henry VIII declared himself head of the church. And first of all, just clergymen, but eventually anybody in political office had to sign the Act of Supremacy, which declared that the king was the head of the church in England. So it was basically a secularist uprising against the power of the church. And one of the motivations for it, obviously, Henry VIII wanted to get rid of his wife. He wanted to get rid of 7 of his wives in the end, but the first one, his legitimate wife, Catherine of Aragon, he wanted to get rid of her. He's having an affair with Anne Boleyn. He got Anne Boleyn pregnant, that made the whole thing somewhat urgent. So we have this heir to the throne, Elizabeth, who's illegitimate, right, conceived out of wedlock. And again, even Shakespeare's plays, all of the periods during Elizabeth's reign, the history plays and many of the plays about the legitimacy of the monarch, whether this is the true monarch or not. Because the Catholic position, from Pope Pius V we get to as well, is that she wasn't the true monarch. Mary, Queen of Scots, was the true monarch, which is one of the reasons Elizabeth had to put to death. Get her out of the way, right? So in the English Reformation, render unto Caesar the things that are God's. The king is the head of the church. The king destroyed all the monasteries and convents in England, confiscated the money for himself, and then handed the money out and the land out to those that would do his bidding. So basically, if you were selfish, you became rich. And if you were true to the faith, you became poor very quickly. So in this first generation of Catholics responding to the English Reformation, we have St. John Fisher. And there are lessons here. He was a very learned man, a scholar. He was Chancellor of Cambridge University. Friends of people such as Erasmus, some of the great humanists of the time. He was one of the great intellectuals, one of the great scholars of his age. But he was also very pious and lived a very austere life. He had the habit of putting a skull, a human skull, on the altar during Mass as a memento mori, as a reminder of death. And throughout the history of the Church, the memento mori, the reminder of death, the skull, is meant to remind us of the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Okay, so he put the skull on the altar during Mass to remind himself, while he was celebrating Mass, and the congregation, of his own mortality and the four last things. He lived a very austere life. He was made Bishop of Rochester in Kent, and at the time he was made bishop, at the beginning of the 1500s, it was the poorest diocese in the whole of England, and he stayed there. And although he was intimate with the royal family, King Henry's grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, John Fisher was her confessor. He taught King Henry VIII when he was Prince Hal, when he was just a boy. He gave the funeral oration at both Henry's grandmother's funeral and at King Henry VII's funeral. So he's intimate with the royal family and yet lived an extremely austere life in Rochester. Very holy man. But he said, when Henry VIII started talking about wanting a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, almost says Saint Catherine of Aragon there, so before I just slip on my part. In England, by the way, if you ever get to England, Peterborough Cathedral in Cambridgeshire, Catherine of Aragon is buried there under the ground in the church itself, in the nave. And I used to travel regularly from when I was living in Norwich in Norfolk to York and change trains in Peterborough, and I used to get off and walk to Peterborough Cathedral and say my personal devotions to Catherine of Aragon. So she's not been canonised, but I believe she's in heaven. And what John Fisher said is that he was willing to die to defend the indissolubility of marriage in relation to Henry VIII's war on his wife. And the people of England began to see a similarity between St. John Fisher's stand against the king and John the Baptist in the Gospel. Again, with his defense of marriage, basically. And so March 1534, the Act of Succession was passed by Henry. The Act of Succession was forcing all the clergy in England and other people to sign, saying that the offspring of Anne Boleyn, who was crowned Queen of England after a rushed-through divorce, basically what they did, they put St. John Fisher in prison, just to get him out of the way, right? No charges, just put him in prison. Thomas Cranmer was made Archbishop of Canterbury, and he did the king's bidding. So he gave the king a quickie divorce, and then he was quickly married to a 6-month pregnant wife, a concubine until then, Anne Boleyn. And then the Act of Succession was passed that basically you had to sign that the offspring of Anne Boleyn were the legal heirs to the throne, to the succession, right? And the reason that act was passed was quite clearly she was illegitimate and therefore she couldn't be, right, by law, right? She wasn't born within the holy wedlock. Well, St. John Fisher resigned and refused to sign it. So did Thomas More, who was Chancellor of England at the time. So within a few weeks of that, the following month in April, he was arrested, spends the remainder of his life, the next 14 months or so, in prison in the Tower of London. And again, the popular thing, St. John Fisher, St. John the Baptist, standing up against the power of the king, the power of Herod. And this was accentuated because he was originally going to be hanged, drawn and quartered, which is a very gruesome way to be put to death. But that was softened to beheading for both him and Thomas More. But of course, that heightened the connection with John the Baptist, right? For the people of England. And so he was beheaded, his body was stripped naked and left on the scaffold all day long. Old man, ignominiously. His head, and eventually just thrown into an unmarked grave without any funeral prayers or anything over his body. His head was stuck on a spike on London Bridge as a warning. But again, 2 weeks later, it was still red. There was no sign of decay. So this has heightened the fact that this is like John the Baptist, right? So people were already seeing John Fisher as a saint, so it's backfiring. And the reason that St. John Fisher's head was removed from that spike after 2 weeks is because it was replaced by St. Thomas More's head. And John Fisher's head was thrown into the Thames. So on to St. Thomas More. There's the legend of Thomas More, right? I mean, even in the 20th century, we've all seen. Let's have a show of hands. Raise your hands if you've seen A Man for All Seasons. There we are. Okay. So there's the Robert Bolt wrote the play, of course, and then there's the early version with Paul Schofield as Thomas More, and the later one, made for TV version with Charlton Heston. Is it Ben Hur playing Thomas More? It wasn't quite as good artistically, but anyway, so you have these two versions, and then more recently, of course, we have Hilary Mantle's hideous depiction of Wolf Hall, where Thomas More becomes the villain, and the monster Thomas Cromwell becomes the hero. Talk about completely rewriting history. But the most interesting dramatisation of the life of St. Thomas More, and I'll talk about this in the book here, is a play that was written probably in the late 1500s, so within 50 or so years of Thomas More's execution. Now, of course, it couldn't be performed publicly. No way, Queen Elizabeth, right, Henry VIII's daughter. But when Elizabeth first died in 1603, there was a brief period of 14 months when all the anti-Catholic laws were suspended. Because James I promised that he would do that when he became king, and he tried to. But Parliament, by this time, was very puritanical, basically run by Puritans. I mean, 40 years later, they chop off the head of the king, right? That's how powerful they were getting. But they said they're not going to tolerate Catholicism. So after 14 months, the laws were passed as bad as ever against the Catholics. And that's another issue. But during that 14-month period of freedom, religious freedom in England, this play, Sir Thomas More, was offered to the King's censor, official censor, to be passed so it could be performed publicly. And there's a real mystery about this because there are 6 different handwriting on it. One of which is definitely William Shakespeare's. And other major playwrights at the time, as well as Sir Edmund Tilney, who was the King's censor, with his comments. And I argue, and I'll give the arguments for, I don't have time to do it now, that I believe actually that the whole play was written by William Shakespeare and probably performed for recusant families. So in England, basically the Catholic families that were outlaws paid fines for refusing to attend the state religion. They were called recusants. And some of these more wealthy recusant families, they used to have that Catholic players, theatre groups going around. And we know that some of Shakespeare's plays were performed at these recusant houses. So I think this was probably one of Shakespeare's early plays, actually written for performance to Catholic audiences. When Elizabeth first dies, it's then put before the censor, hoping it can actually be performed publicly now. And some of the other playwrights were involved because some of these were very anti-Catholic under Elizabeth. They saw the way the tide was turning. King James is married to a Catholic. All the anti-Catholic laws had been suspended. Catholics were coming out the closet all over the place, right? I mean, no one could believe how many Catholics were still around, right? So I think some of these playwrights were saying, well, we better go on, right? I've got to cover my tracks now. So they wanted a big piece of the action. So they sort of rewrote bits that might have been problematic. And it never happened because before the process, the laws changed again. And the play was never actually performed until the next Queen Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth II, about 20 years ago. So again, on Thomas More, I wanted to have time to speak of some of the other saints. So, like St. John Fisher, was a great scholar. knew the works of Aristotle, read the works of Aristotle in Greek, read Boethius in Latin, taught St. Augustine's City of God. In many ways, St. Augustine's City of God is, if you like, the sort of the motto for Thomas More's own philosophy. Right? You have the city of man, you have the city of God, and you need to give your devotion, your time, your loyalty, and your life to the city of God, not to the city of man. Which is why when he was in the same position as Sir John Fisher, it was easy for him. How dare I say it was easy for him? I'm sure it wasn't easy. But his conscience basically made it necessary for him to choose the city of God instead of the city of man, even if it meant his death. And there are all sorts of anecdotes about him. There's about him being at Mass and someone tapping him on the shoulder at Mass and saying, you know, the king wants you. The king needs you. And he said, what? The king will have to wait the moment I'm kneeling before a greater king. And then, after he became Chancellor of England, basically the most powerful political position in England other than the king, someone complained that he was wearing a surplice to sing in the choir at Mass. And he said, that's not unbecoming for a man of your rank. You know, and he basically said, look, this is for Mass. This is very becoming. And then, on a religious procession, someone said, surely you're not intending to walk. You're Chancellor of England. You know, his horse. He said, our Lord walked. I think I can walk. Think of the Via Dolorosa. This is what a man that he was, that Henry VIII was up against. So he refused to sign the Act of Succession because he didn't obviously accept that Anne Boleyn's child was the legitimate heir, because Henry was still married to Catherine of Aragon, regardless of what laws he passed to do his bidding. And like John Fisher, was arrested and beheaded. But prior to that, and this is one of the greatest arguments for priestly celibacy, because it was harder for Sir Thomas More than it was for Sir John Fisher. First of all, Sir John Fisher is an older man, well, he's an older man, but he's a priest. He's married to the church, in persona Christi. That's his spouse. That's who he's chosen. Of course, he should be expected to lay down his life for his spouse. And God help all of those other bishops in England who completely and utterly caved in. And yet you think about, right, we've got lots of weak bishops around here these days. In England, in 1534, only one had the courage to say no to the king. The rest submitted. And it was easy for them, easier for them than St. Thomas More. He had children, a wife, property. And he's got his wife and his favourite daughter, Margaret, coming to visit him in prison, trying to persuade him, just do what's necessary to get out. You've only got to say, cross your fingers or something, right? You don't have to mean it. Just say what you need to say to get out. So he's got the women he loves in his life trying to persuade him to take the easy option. And even worse than that, King Henry VIII starts showing the same complete disdain against Caesar, right? Think about modern governments, show the same disregard for property rights as he showed for the rights of marriage. Basically, it's obviously taken all the church's land for himself. Thomas More's land, he just not repossessed, he never possessed it before, he just took Thomas More's land, gave it to his allies. So Thomas More was still alive and could see that his family were being impoverished by his decision. That's much harder. And it's also one of the best arguments I know for priestly celibacy. We should be able to expect our priests to lay down their life for the spouse of Jesus Christ and his church. Obviously, hopefully we'll be able to do the same ourselves as married people with children. Please God. But it's harder for us. And it says a great deal for St. Thomas More that he stood firm. And of course, from the scaffold, those famous words, I am the king's good servant, but God's first. And again, to that today, in the secular environment we live in today, those words are as important as ever. Now, America is one nation under God. And it's under God. And if anybody ever tells us that our patriotism needs to replace our religion, or there's a conflict between the two, we're in the same position as St. Thomas More. We have to be, in that case, I suppose, the president's good servant, but God's first. All right, let's go across the channel now. Obviously, England's a mess, right? Thanks be to God, things aren't as bad today as they were then. But at least if we go across the sea, they're not, in England, the Catholic Church, the Catholic religion is now against the law. It's punishable by death to be a priest. It's punishable by death to harbour a priest. In Catholic Europe, things are much better, right? Well, let's just cross the channel and take a look. Same time, we're talking about 1530s, 1520s in fact. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V finds himself at war with the German princes. The German princes, most of them weren't particularly Protestant. They were using Luther as an excuse to pursue their own secular desires, their own secular ambitions. So Holy Roman Emperor Charles V is at war with the German princes in the north because of the revolution that Luther stirred up. But what about good old Catholic France? We always rely on good old Catholic France. Not quite. Francis I, King Francis I of France is at war with the Holy Roman Emperor. And therefore in de facto alliance with the Protestant princes and with Islam against the Holy Roman Emperor. And if that's pretty bad. But the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, wins a major battle against the French. Hip, hip, hooray, okay? He marches on Rome. The bulk of his army are Protestant mercenaries. And in 1527, Rome is sacked for the first time for about 1,000 years. And blasphemous mummeries of the Mass are being said in Catholic churches in Rome by these drunken Protestant mercenaries. The Pope is kidnapped. A future Pope is actually hung by his hair. So Rome is sacked. 1527. Things can't get much worse than that, can they? Well, 2 years later, the Muslim army of the Turks invades Europe and get as far as Vienna. 1529 is the siege of Vienna. 120,000 Muslim troops besieged the city, only 17,000 Christians inside the defense. And you want to call it a miracle, what you want to call it, the siege was lifted. The Muslims returned back. If they weren't, right, we could be talking about a Muslim Europe in the 1500s. So things weren't that good in Europe, right? They weren't good in England, but they weren't that good in Europe. And against all this, what about Spain? Good old Catholic Spain. Rely on Catholic Spain, surely. Well, the northern part of Spain, nothing's changed there, by the way. You know about Barcelona and Catalonia and the Basque region. The region of Navarre in the north of Spain wanted independence from Madrid, right? And so they, with French money and French troops, there was a war basically in northern Spain. On that war, a young man called Ignatius Loyola was a soldier, for the Spanish side. By the grace of God, he was blown to pieces. Well, he wasn't blown to pieces, his leg was shattered by a cannonball. He was crippled, walked with a limp the rest of his life. And he was a troubadour, he was a sinner. There's, I quote in here, his lifestyle prior to his conversion. And he's stuck in bed. And the last thing he wants to do is to read any book, but particularly not a religious book. The only two books there were religious books. A Life of Christ and A Life of the Saints. So stuck in bed with no choice, very reluctantly, he picks up the books and has a profound religious conversion. And then obviously later on were found the Jesuits. I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the other founders of the Jesuits was St. Francis Xavier. When Ignatius Loyola and Francis Xavier first met, they were sharing rooms together in Paris. They were students. They didn't like each other. There's a good reason for it. Because Francis Xavier was a bit younger, but his older brothers, who were about the same age as Ignatius, had fought in the same war as Ignatius on the opposite side. On the side of the Navarrese and Navarre, on the French side. And because that side lost, in punishment, while Francis Xavier as a boy was living there, the family castle, right, was effectively destroyed. The moat was filled in, all the walls were pulled down, was put under, just enough was left for them to live in. That was happening while he was a boy. So you have the, again, imagine, right, put yourself in their shoes. There's a hatred, an enmity there. Your people caused my house to be destroyed, my family's house to be destroyed. My brothers fought against you. And yet they become, of course, great friends, great allies, and founding members of the Jesuits. And again, we're looking for things happening here. Europe's a mess. Where's the Jesuit order founded? It's founded the foot of Montmartre in Paris, in a church dedicated to St. Peter. Right? The Jesuits, of course, I mean, Ignatius Loyola believed that his conversion, his miraculous conversion, spiritual healing was due to the intercession of St. Peter. So they were personal devotion to him. But of course, they were a bit loyal directly to the Pope. So being founded in St. Peter's Church was symbolically appropriate. But even more, Montmartre, right? The mountain of the martyrs, where Saint Denis was martyred in the early time of the early church. But before it was called Montmartre, the mountain of the martyrs, it was called Mons Martis in Latin. The mountain of Mars, the war god. Right? And think about Ignatius